Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Stephen Kitchell, and I'm doing my presentation over Herod the Great. Now, in the Bible, it records that Herod the Great tried to have baby Jesus killed at Bethlehem. However, history also remembers Herod as Herod the Great, so there's a very strong polarization between Herod in the Bible and how history remembers him. So today we're going to be going over the rise of King Herod to power and his reign as he's king of Judea, and we'll be finishing this presentation with Judas's betrayal of Jesus from a historical perspective. So, Judea gained its independence during the Maccabean revolt about 100 years before the birth of Herod, and Herod was born in year 73 BC. Now, Herod was not ethnically Jewish. Herod was part Edomite and part Arab, although his father's family was practicing Jews for nearly a century. So, religiously, he was Jewish. Ethnically, he was not Jewish, and this could be very scandalous in Judea at the time. And Herod was also not born into royalty. He was the son of a wealthy merchant. Now, 5 years after Herod was born, the queen of Judea died with leaving no clear heir, and her two sons fought a civil war over who was going to become king of Judea. And this civil war went on for years, until the Roman general Pompey intervened, making one son and client king and annexing large parts of Judea into the Roman Empire in the year 63 BC. So from this point on, Judea was now a client kingdom of the Roman Empire. Now, Herod's father, since he was a wealthy merchant, he saw opportunity in working with the Roman Empire. So Herod's father began cooperating with the Romans to establish himself as the real power behind the throne. Since he was not actually royalty, he could be the person behind the scenes pulling the strings. And then in 57 BC, a Jewish uprising called Herod's father and a Roman client king to call for help from the Romans. And this Roman army was led by a Roman general, Mark Antony. And Mark Antony was introduced to a 16-year-old Herod at the time, and they became friends. And Mark Antony, he was 26 years old, and he was a Roman general. And this friendship between King Herod and Mark Antony is going to really define a lot of King Herod's reign and his rise to power. Now, soon after the revolt was crushed, Rome fell into its first civil war. Now, Rome was a republic at the time, but they had three unofficial rulers, and they were known as the First Triumvirate. The first person was Marcus Crassus. He was killed by the Parthians, who were the modern-day Iranians, in the year 53 BC. Then you had Pompey. He was one who annexed large parts of Judea and put the Roman client king in place. Then you had Julius Caesar, and he's one of the most famous Romans in history. Now, the Roman Civil War began in January 49 BC. Herod and the king of Judea, because remember, Herod was not king yet, they backed Julius Caesar. And Caesar defeated Pompey's forces on 9 August 48 BC at the Battle of Pharsalus in modern-day Greece. So Herod and the king of Judea, they backed the winning side. So Pompey, one of the rulers of the Roman Empire, he fled to Egypt to escape Caesar. Caesar followed Pompey to Egypt, but the Egyptian pharaoh Ptolemy XIII had Pompey killed, because back then you wanted to kill the enemy of someone you make friends with to demonstrate your loyalty to them. However, Caesar still considered Pompey a friend, even though they just fought a war with each other. So history records that Caesar actually broke down crying when he was presented with Pompey's head. But he decided not to punish the Egyptians for still bringing the head. And Egypt at this time, it was also a Roman client state exactly like Judea was, and was ruled by the Ptolemy dynasty, hence the name Ptolemy XIII. Now, the Ptolemies, they were not Egyptian, they were Greek, because after the death of Alexander the Great, his empire was broken up into 4 kingdoms. And one of his generals was named Ptolemy. They took Egypt, Judea, and that region of the world. And the Ptolemies did not marry outside their family. So they married inside their family for 300 years. So Cleopatra and her brother Ptolemy XIII, they were the product of 300 years of incest. Because Cleopatra, she was married to her brother Ptolemy XIII, but she was driven out, and her brother married another sister. So when Caesar arrived, he was greeted by Ptolemy XIII and Cleopatra's sister. So as I said, Ptolemy XIII, he was 11 years old. Cleopatra's sister was 15 years old. Cleopatra was 21 or 22. So Caesar met with Ptolemy XIII and Cleopatra's sister, because Cleopatra, she was the outcast, she was outside the family in the desert. So to meet with Caesar, Cleopatra snuck herself into the palace. What she did is she rolled herself up in a rug. Some servants loyal to Cleopatra brought her in, and they unrolled the rug in Caesar's presence, which is what this picture right here is. It's Caesar being unrolled in Cleopatra's presence. This really impressed Caesar, and so Cleopatra was able to get her one-on-one meeting with Julius Caesar. Then after the meeting, Caesar decreed that Cleopatra and Ptolemy XIII would rule jointly. Now, Ptolemy XIII and Cleopatra's sister did not like this, and they sent the Egyptian army in to defeat Cleopatra and Caesar. And during this battle, Caesar and Cleopatra were victorious, and Ptolemy XIII drowned, and Cleopatra's sister was captured. So with this, Cleopatra was now the queen of Egypt. Another thing that happened is that Cleopatra had a child with Caesar, who she named Ptolemy XV Caesar. So this was very scandalous at the time, both in Rome and in Egypt, because Caesar was married to a Roman woman. So having a child with an Egyptian woman was a scandalous thing to do. And also for Egypt, the Ptolemies only married inside the family. So this was a non-incestual child being born, which was a very scandalous thing to do in Egypt at the time. But Caesar was now the most powerful person in the Roman Empire, and Queen Cleopatra, she was the most powerful person in the Egyptian in Egypt at the time. So it was they were able to make it work. And after this, Herod's father was made financial governor of Judea and was given Roman citizenship, which he passed on to Herod. So at this point, Herod was now a Roman citizen. And in 47 BC, Herod was made governor of Galilee. And as soon after he became governor of Galilee, there was another uprising. This one was known as the New Maccabean Revolt, because, as I said, over 100 years earlier, there was the Maccabean Revolt that freed Judea from Greek rule. This was a new Maccabean Revolt designed to free Judea from Roman rule. But this didn't work. So Herod just absolutely crushed the new Maccabean Revolt. And the brutality that Herod used was so bad, Herod was brought in front of the high priest of Jerusalem, and they threatened to have Herod executed for what he did. However, he was not executed, and he was allowed to return being governor of Galilee. Remember, Jesus was Galilean, and his ministry was in Galilee. And so then, by the time this is all done, Caesar departed Egypt in 47 BC. And Egypt was still a client kingdom. Now, the problem between Rome and Egypt, it wasn't that Rome could not defeat Egypt militarily. They could easily do it. The problem was Egypt was arguably one of the most wealthiest countries in the world. So from the Rome, you don't want your opponent taking control of Egypt, because then they can just outspend you and they'll take over the entire Roman Empire. So Egypt remained a client kingdom under the rule of the Egyptian queen at this time, Cleopatra, because nobody in Rome wanted their opponent taking over Egypt, and so they just left it there. It's kind of thorn in their side they couldn't get rid of. And so Caesar, after making Cleopatra queen of Egypt, he returned to the Rome, and this is where he starts the death of the Roman Empire, of the Roman Republic, because Rome was not an empire at the time; it was a republic. Because in 46 BC, Caesar held another military campaign in the Africa province, and this was to defeat the remainder of the Roman Republican forces and the remainder of Pompey's forces. Then after Caesar was victorious, many people were very afraid of what was about to happen in the Roman Empire, because tradition back then stated, if someone sided with your opponent, you hunt them down and destroy them. However, Caesar, he granted clemency to many of his opponents to bring peace and calm to the Roman Empire to stop these wars, and it was successful. There was a lot of peace and calm brought. Then when Caesar returned to Rome, the Roman Senate granted Caesar greater powers, which Caesar accepted, making him the most undisputed powerful person in the Roman Empire. Around this time, Cleopatra, the Egyptian queen, and remember, Egypt's one of the wealthiest regions in the world, she went to Rome to visit Julius Caesar. And by February 44 BC, Caesar had himself nicknamed Dictator for Life. Now, however, there are still a lot of Roman Republican forces and people who did not support Julius Caesar being named Dictator for Life. On March 44 BC, Julius Caesar was assassinated by Brutus and Cassius right in the Roman Senate. Cleopatra, she was in Egypt, well, she was in Rome when this happened, so she fled to Egypt. That way she wouldn't be killed, and there was just nothing for her in Rome at that point. It was too high a risk for her to stay. Now, Mark Antony, remember, Mark Antony was he was the friend of Herod when Herod was only 16 years old. Mark Antony and Caesar's nephew Octavian declared a new war to defeat Caesar's assassins, Brutus and Cassius. So you had the Roman Empire forces under the command of Mark Antony and Octavian versus the Roman Republican forces under the command of Brutus and Cassius. Brutus and Cassius fled to the eastern provinces of Rome, where they ordered all eastern provinces to pay so they could raise an army to fight the next Roman civil war. Judea, being an eastern province, had to pay 15,000 kilograms of silver, or the inhabitants were to be killed. So Herod's father, being the chief tax collector, he had to raise this money. But this was a very, very unpopular move in Judea, and Herod's father was killed by an assassin in the year 43 BC. And so even though Herod's father was killed, the Second Roman Civil War still took place. And during this war, Brutus and Cassius, leading the Roman Republican forces, were killed at the Battle of Philippi in Greece. So the Roman Empire forces were victorious. They won the Civil War. And remember, the Roman Empire forces were led by Mark Antony and Octavian. Mark Antony began riding through the Roman provinces, which supported Brutus and Cassius, destroying them and punishing them for their support. However, when Mark Antony made it to Judea, he trusted his old friendship with Herod and spared him. So Herod, he was spared from being executed. And after this, Herod was made ruler of Galilee, Herod's brother was made ruler of Jerusalem, and the king of Judea was more of a figurehead. So Herod and his family, they now held the power in Judea. And they were Roman client rule, and they're still under the rule of Rome. And also, Mark Antony also began to become very fond of Cleopatra, because even at a young age, Mark Antony, he was always enthralled by her. He first met Cleopatra in Rome when she was Caesar's mistress, but since she had a child with Caesar and Caesar was still alive and he was dictator for life, nothing ever happened between those two. However, this began to change because Egypt, with all its wealth, had a single queen now. And Mark Antony, now one of the most powerful people in the Roman Empire, he was looking east towards Parthia. And since Egypt had the wealth, it was really a natural match between the two. So Cleopatra made her way to Tarsus to meet with Mark Antony. They had dinner and went to Alexandria, Egypt for the winter of 41 to 40 BC. And later on that year, Cleopatra gave birth to Mark Antony's twins. So now Cleopatra has one child with Caesar, 2 children with Mark Antony. And Cleopatra and Mark Antony did not meet again for another 3.5 years. Now, in 40 BC, this is where we come to the Parthians. Because the Parthians, remember, they're the modern-day Iranians. They're right over here in the east. The Roman Empire was over here in the west that stretched around the Mediterranean. And you have Egypt down here, and Judea as their client kingdoms of the Roman Empire. The Parthians invaded, and they killed the king of Judea and took the prince of Judea back to Parthia. And Herod's brother, when the Parthians were coming, committed suicide to avoid being killed by the Parthians. Herod, he fled to Alexandria, Egypt, where he met with Cleopatra. Herod's father was an ally to the Ptolemaic dynasty. So Cleopatra, being head of the Ptolemaic dynasty, owed King Herod a favor. Plus, Egypt was right next to Judea. She did not want the Parthians invading Egypt. So Cleopatra agreed to give Herod a ship to sail to Rome to gain the support of the Second Triumvirate, Mark Antony and Octavian, and bring an army back and defeat the Parthians. So Herod sailed from Alexandria to Rome, and when he's off the coast of Rome, the ship sunk, and Herod had to swim ashore. Then after he swam ashore, he met with Octavian asking for help against the Parthians. Well, Rome was really embroiled in an internal dispute right then, so they were not able to lead the army, but they still granted an army to King Herod. So King Herod brought many Roman soldiers back to fight the Parthians and make himself king of Judea. And so this war took place for the next 3 years. And then at the end of the war, King Herod was unanimously voted by the Roman Senate to be made king of Jerusalem. Now, here's a summary slide for all the names we threw out there. The first triumvirate, that was led by Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus. They're all dead. The Roman Republicans was led by Brutus and Cassius. They were also Caesar's assassins. They're both dead. The second triumvirate, you have Octavian, who is Caesar's nephew. He's currently in Rome. Mark Antony, he's currently in Athens, preparing to invade Parthia. And there's another one named Marcus. I didn't go into him at all, but he is removed from power. So Rome is now split between Octavian and Mark Antony. Coming over here to Egypt, Ptolemy the 13th, he's dead. Cleopatra in Egypt and has one child with Caesar and 2 children with Mark Antony. And coming down to Judea, Herod's father, he was assassinated, so he's dead. Herod's brother, he committed suicide when the Parthians invaded. The former king of Judea, he's alive, but he's in Parthian captivity right now. And then Herod, he's currently king of Judea. So with this, we're going into the next part, which is ruling Judea. Now, while Mark Antony was in Athens preparing to invade Parthia, he renewed his friendship with Cleopatra, and Cleopatra became pregnant again. Now she's going to have her 4th child overall, and her 3rd with Mark Antony. And while she was there, the region was reorganized, giving Egypt many of the coastal regions from today's Mount Carmel in Lebanon and part of Sicilia. And Cleopatra asked Mark Antony for Judea in 37 BC. However, Mark Antony would not give Cleopatra Judea. And the reason behind this is since the Roman Senate unanimously voted to give King Herod his kingship, Mark Antony did not want to cross the Roman Senate. So they said, no, you cannot have Judea. However, this did not stop Cleopatra from pushing what she wanted, because after Cleopatra met with Mark Antony, she met with King Herod in Judea, and Jericho was leased to Egypt, and Judea took the regions surrounding Egypt. So all the wealthy regions in Judea she took, but she didn't actually take Judea itself. So Herod was really the king of a very small nation that had no wealth. Now, this made Herod look really bad that he could not stop this Egyptian queen from just coming down and taking all of his land. So Herod tried to claim that the Egyptian queen came down because she was just absolutely overcome with love for him and tried to force herself onto him. And this was to smear Cleopatra to his council and to Judeans, which probably did not work out very well because she still walked away with all the wealth while leaving Judea in place. But this still did not stop her from continuing to push to take the rest of Judea. Because there was an internal dispute within Herod's court, because Herod's wife family turned on Herod when he did not appoint his 16-year-old brother-in-law as high priest, or rather someone outside of the family. So Herod's mother-in-law, Alexandria, now Alexandria is the person, Alexandria is the city. Alexandria sent word to Cleopatra, hoping she would help a fellow woman rid Judea of King Herod to make her son the high priest. Which Cleopatra was more than happy to do because she still wanted to get rid of King Herod and still take over Judea. So she went to Mark Antony, and Mark Antony was not going to help Cleopatra out on this one. So Mark Antony just didn't get involved. So King Herod, since he couldn't go to Mark Antony because Cleopatra was Mark Antony's girlfriend, and Mark Antony was not going to go against his girlfriend, but he also wasn't going to go against the Roman Senate. So Herod assembled his council to complain against Alexandria if she was placed under house arrest. So Cleopatra decided that she wanted to free Alexandria and bring her back to Egypt. So she sent a ship to bring Alexandria out of prison. However, this did not work because as Alexandria was being brought out of prison to the ship, she was betrayed by a servant loyal to King Herod. So as she's leaving, she physically runs into King Herod as she's trying to escape. And she thought she's going to be executed right there on the spot. But King Herod did not want to kill Alexandria because had she done that, Cleopatra could turn around and claim that she was now justified to invade Judea and depose King Herod. So King Herod, standing in front of Alexandria as she was trying to escape, chose to forgive. But he also at the same time plotted revenge against Alexandria, looking for an opportunity to really punish her. So one of the things he did is he invited his brother-in-law over to Jericho for a swim, and the brother-in-law drowned, to which Herod had acted absolutely devastated in public. You know, he's my favorite brother-in-law. I can't believe this happened. This was a total accident. So Herod put in this grand funeral for him to tell all of Judea that he was absolutely devastated with what happened. Well, Alexandria did not exactly agree with that version of events. So Alexandra wrote to Cleopatra, who wrote to Mark Antony, who was in Parthia at the time, to punish King Herod for drowning Herod's brother-in-law, which is Alexandra's son. So Mark Antony eventually met with King Herod to figure out what was going on over there, because he keeps getting all his letters saying that Herod needs to be punished for what he's doing. So Mark Antony and Herod met with each other, and Mark Antony decided that he was not going to punish Herod. But this did not stop a lot of the females of Herod's court from still trying to depose of him, because Herod was told by many of his female relatives that his wife sent a portrait of herself to Mark Antony. So Herod had her executed, and this one actually did legitimately devastate Herod after he had his wife executed. So after he was this one was legit. So he had his son-in-law put to death, and his mother-in-law placed in prison while he decided what he was going to do. So first thing he did was fortified his defenses along the Egyptian border in case Queen Cleopatra decided to invade. The next thing he did was he left Jerusalem on an extended hunting trip while he tried to process all the emotions. What am I going to do now? So upon returning from his extended hunting trip, Herod had his mother-in-law executed. And so now that he didn't have a wife anymore, his mother-in-law was executed, he decided to marry a woman from an old ruling dynasty to gain legitimacy in court. And another thing he did to gain legitimacy is he had the old king of Judea brought back in Parthia to gain his support for Herod's rulership. Because the old king in Judea, remember, when the Parthians invaded in 40 BC, the king was executed and the prince was taken back to Parthia. Well, the prince, now king, was a very, very weak king and a very weak person. So the king was brought back on the condition that he would support King Herod in making for being king. That way really eliminates any opposition to his rulership. And it worked. And then Herod also went ahead and built new city walls for Jerusalem. He built a new citadel to protect the temple called Antonia, which was named after Mark Antony, since Mark Antony and King Herod were still friends with each other. He also had coins minted showing himself alongside traditional Jewish objects. Because remember, King Herod was not ethnically Jewish. He was half Arab, half Edomite. So he's trying to gain legitimacy in court and gain legitimacy in the people by portraying himself as Jewish. And this is all to stabilize the kingdom of Judea. Now, Mark Antony, he went to Alexandria, Egypt in 34 BC after he was defeated in Parthia. Because remember, Mark Antony moved to the east to conquer the Parthians, which it turned out to be a military defeat for Mark Antony in Rome. So he returns to Alexandria, where Queen Cleopatra has a couple of his children. And while he was there, Mark Antony divided up territory between Cleopatra and her children. Because Alexander was to receive Armenia, Media, and the lands as far east as India. Because even though Rome did not control this territory at the time, Mark Antony intended to get another Roman army and conquer Parthia and these territories. And after it was conquered, it was going to be given to one of Cleopatra's children. Another one, Ptolemy Philadelphus, was to become king of the Syrian territories in Asia Minor. Another one, Cleopatra Selene, received modern-day eastern half of Libya and Crete. And then Caesarion, the oldest, and the child she had with Caesar, ruled beside his mother in Egypt and was declared king of kings. Now, I want to make one thing clear. He was not just giving out the Roman Empire to Queen Cleopatra in Egypt. What he was doing was he's using Egypt to assume the cost for administration. Because had Rome decided that they were going to administer everything, Rome would have had to send all their army, all their administrators out to deal with rebellions, deal with administrative costs. But by giving this out to Egypt, Egypt was assuming the cost for it. So Egypt was able to expand their portion of their empire, and Rome saved a lot of money doing it in the process. So it was a win-win situation. And Egypt was still a client kingdom of the Roman Empire. And so Rome could still take it away from Egypt at any point they wanted. But then what Mark Antony done that started to become very scandalous was Mark Antony began issuing coins which depicted Cleopatra, which was something that was never done in Rome. Because now a lot of people in Rome felt that this Egyptian queen was taking control of Mark Antony, and they were starting to lose their empire. Because many people started to see Mark Antony as the emperor and this Egyptian queen as the empress, which was really starting to turn a lot of people in Rome against Mark Antony and Cleopatra. Now, remember, Octavian and Mark Antony, they're the two most powerful people in the Roman Empire, Octavian being Caesar's nephew. And distrust began to grow between Octavian and Mark Antony. Because remember, Egypt is one of the wealthiest regions in the Roman Empire. And so Mark Antony is taking over a lot of the wealth, which Octavian does not like. So there were envoys being sent between Alexandria and Rome with verbal accusations. Octavian was accusing Mark Antony of saying, look, this is he's being controlled by Egypt. A foreign queen is ruling him. Mark Antony was saying that Octavian was not holding up his end of the treaties between himself and Mark Antony. So there's accusations flying back and forth between both sides. Because Octavian, he wanted a war in which he could remove Mark Antony, but he also wanted to blame Mark Antony for it. So Octavian was trying to figure out how to start a war without taking the blame. And then another thing Octavian did while they're trading insults was Octavian had Mark Antony's Roman wife sent to Egypt. Remember, while Mark Antony was had Cleopatra as his girlfriend, he had his wife in Rome. And so with his Mark Antony's Roman wife arriving in Egypt to live in the same place as Cleopatra, that was just causing Mark Antony a lot of problems and a lot of drama that he brought on himself. And by 33 BC, Mark Antony eventually began to realize that he cannot avoid war with Octavian. So rather than turning towards Parthia, he had to turn towards another civil war within the Roman Empire. And so Mark Antony, he controlled the entire Eastern Sea Power, which was 30 legions, 12,000 light armed infantry, and 12,000 cavalry. And King Herod, being friends with Mark Antony, decided that he was going to support Mark Antony in this war. So Herod arrived with money, an army, equipment, and a shipment of grain. So Judean soldiers were going to march with the Roman with Mark Antony's army in the Roman Civil War. Herod told Mark Antony that Cleopatra would hurt his chances of victory and told Mark Antony to execute Cleopatra and annex Egypt. Because Octavian in Western Rome was saying that Cleopatra was ruling Mark Antony, and Mark Antony has become a client of Cleopatra. So it was making him look really bad. So Herod was like, hey, if you execute Cleopatra, then there's no case against you. You're going to win the war. However, Mark Antony did not have Cleopatra executed. And so by April 31 BC, Mark Antony and Cleopatra departed for Greece with their army. And now what you have is Mark Antony bringing a foreign queen and her army to march on Rome. And this really scared Rome. It's like, why is a foreign queen marching against us? This is an invasion. This is not a civil war. So the Roman Senate voted to deprive Mark Antony of his consulship, and Octavian declared war on Cleopatra. Notice, Octavian did not declare war on Mark Antony. He declared war on Cleopatra because he said the enemy here is not Mark Antony. The enemy here is Cleopatra, and she's controlling Mark Antony. And so this was the next war that the Roman Empire was falling into. And then on 2 September 31 BC, Mark Antony was defeated at the Battle of Actium. And at this battle, Mark Antony and Cleopatra on their boats fled, abandoning their army. And then after their leader fled, the Mark Antony's army didn't want to fight anymore. So after a week of negotiations, Octavian agreed to allow Mark Antony's army in on the spoils of victory, and so his army surrendered. And with this, Mark Antony and Cleopatra lost virtually all their power. Now, King Herod, remember, he just supported Mark Antony. King Herod was summoned to Rhodes to explain himself to Octavian. Because remember, Mark Antony and King Herod were friends with each other from a very young age. Mark Antony repeatedly supported King Herod in being king of Judea. King Herod built monuments in honor of Mark Antony. He coined coins in honor of Mark Antony. He supported Mark Antony in this war. King Herod had no relationship with Octavian. So now he has to sail from Jerusalem to Rhodes, which is going to be a very long boat ride, to figure out how he has to explain to Octavian why he just did what he did. So King Herod probably thought he was going to be executed. So before King Herod left for Rhodes, he had the former king of Judea executed. Because remember, the former king of Judea was one who was taken captive to Parthia, then brought back. Well, King Herod had him killed. That way, in case King Herod was executed by Octavian, the throne would stay in his family. Then he told Octavian. So when he got to him when he got to Rhodes, rather than try and worm his way out of trouble, he just told Octavian that he supported Mark Antony to the death. He'd been loyal to Mark Antony for decades, and he remained loyal even now, because there's really no way he could explain what he just did. Octavian listened to King Herod, and afterwards he stated, Herod's loyalty is far more useful asset to Rome than someone who tried to worm their way out of trouble. So, had King Herod came and said, well, I was just doing what I was told, I didn't have a choice, Octavian would have had him executed. But since he unapologetically declared his loyalty to King Herod, that's why Octavian let him live. So King Herod was spared, and he returned to Judea to be king of Judea now. And after Octavian was done stabilizing the empire, Octavian sailed to Egypt to deal with Mark Antony and Cleopatra. Because after Mark Antony and Cleopatra abandoned their army, nobody was summoning their calls. They knew they lost. And so Mark Antony, he committed suicide, dying in Cleopatra's arms. And then Cleopatra did not immediately commit suicide after Mark Antony. She committed suicide after Octavian arrived, because Octavian wanted to take her as a captive and bring her back to Rome and have her displayed to the Romans as kind of a victory parade. And rather than let that happen to her, this is when Cleopatra famously committed suicide, and history records that she committed suicide with a snake. Now, there's no doubt that Cleopatra committed suicide, but historians don't think she killed herself with a snake, because that type of snake that history records that she used, his venom was not strong enough to kill an adult. So she definitely poisoned herself, but they don't think it was historically with a snake. And with this, Egypt was now annexed into the Roman Empire, and Octavian was now the only ruler of the Roman Empire, and he took on the imperial title Emperor Augustus. And so, just a summary of where we're at. What Herod survived. Herod survived 3 Roman civil wars, the Parthian invasion of Rome, a shipwreck in Rome, uprisings against him, family members trying to have him removed, and wealth of Judea being taken by Cleopatra. So he just keeps surviving all these tragedies. And then Rome, regarding Rome, as I said, Octavian is now the emperor, Emperor Augustus, and the sole leader of the Roman Empire. And the civil wars are now complete, and Herod is king of Jerusalem and Judea. And so now that there's finally peace in the Roman Empire, Herod is now decided he's going to start building monuments in Judea. So for the next 7 years, he went on a very extensive construction spree. In Jerusalem, he built a new amphitheater, market, palace, new homes that were destroyed by an earthquake, new aqueducts to bring fresh water into the city, fortresses on the border of Judea to protect the kingdom. And then it wasn't just internal to Judea what he was doing. A lot of regions around Judea and the Roman Empire began to see Judean money. So Judea also began expanding their international influence, because their influence began to expand to Beirut and Damascus. And then with all the international influence, King Herod had many Roman contacts. So there was a massive famine from 25 BC to 24 BC. But this famine was staved off because Herod reached out to his Roman contacts and he had a lot of food imported, saving many Judean lives. And then the Roman Emperor Augustus, he visited Herod twice, and each time handed a new land to King Herod. So by the year 20 BC, Judea expanded to include swaths of Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria. And the fame of Jerusalem and Judea was becoming so strong in the Roman Empire, the city was flooded with Roman historians, authors, and playwriters, because this was the place to go to. And so by 14 BC, he was known as Herod the Great, and he probably would have gone down as Herod the Great with a great reputation. And then here's a few things that still survive or became very famous, because here is the Second Temple. Because this is the Second Temple in all its grandeur. Because all this grandeur and all this gold, it was not there before King Herod, because before King Herod, it was a very simple design. But all this grandeur and opulence came in under King Herod when he really built up the Second Temple. And then some that still stands today, like the Western Wall. Here's a picture of the modern day Western Wall. This was built by King Herod. It still stands in Jerusalem today. Another one, the Olympic Games. Because during the time of Herod, the Olympic Games were about to go bankrupt. But it was King Herod who stepped in, funded the Olympic Games, and they still exist today. Because if it was not for King Herod, the Olympic Games would have entirely stopped. So that's still something that still lives on from King Herod. And then this is the fortress of Masada, because these are the ruins of the old fortress. King Herod built the old fortress. So we still have ruins from 2,000 years ago that Herod built that still almost stand today. But the thing is, to get all this international influence, to build all these projects, it requires a lot of money. So during the time of King Herod, taxes were very, very high. And so taxes were so high and tax collectors were so hated during that time, this actually made it into the Bible. Because Matthew chapter 5, when it says to love your enemies, that chapter was also talking about tax collectors because people view tax collectors as the enemy. Matthew chapter 11, Christ was criticized for being a friend of tax collectors. How can the Messiah be friends of tax collectors? They're sinners, they're thieves. Mark chapter 2, tax collectors and sinners had dinner with Christ. Like, you can't have dinner with Christ if you're a tax collector, because you're a sinner. Luke chapter 3, tax collectors came to be baptized. Luke 7, tax collectors agreed with Christ. Like, when Christ is speaking, tax collectors agreed with him, like, oh, look, tax collectors agreed with Christ. The most evil people in the world are agreeing with Christ. He can't be the Messiah. Luke 15, tax collectors and sinners came to listen to Christ. Luke 18, the parable of the tax collector and the Pharisee. Because in that parable, the Pharisee's like, well, at least I'm not a tax collector, because tax collectors were considered the worst people in Judea at the time, because taxes were so high. Luke 19, Zacchaeus was the chief tax collector, and the people believed Christ went to the home of a sinner. It's like, why are you going to the home of a tax collector? These people are evil. And then just to give one breakdown, Mark chapter 12, verses 13 through 17. Later they sent some of the Pharisees and Herodians to Jesus to catch him in his words. They came to him and said, Teacher, we know you're a man of integrity. You aren't swayed by men, because you pay no attention to who they are, but you teach the way of God in accordance with the truth. Is it right to pay taxes to Caesar or not? Should we pay or shouldn't we? Jesus knew the hypocrisy. Why are you trying to trap me? He asked. Bring me a denarius and let me look at it. They brought him a coin, and he asked, Whose portrait is this? And whose inscription? Caesar's, they replied. Then Jesus said unto them, Give to Caesar's what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's. They were amazed at him. Because had Christ said, no, don't pay the taxes, the Romans could have had Christ executed. Had Christ said, yes, pay the taxes, then they would have ran out and said, look, Christ supports these high taxes against you. Do not support Christ. He is not the Messiah. So that was a trap that they were trying to get him in right there. Though Christ said, render unto Caesar's what is Caesar's, and render unto God what is God's. Now, as I said, by 14 BC, Herod was known as Herod the Great. However, by 10 BC, this began to change. Because Herod waged war against the Nabateans, and due to bad results, Herod believed that he fell from favor from the Roman Emperor Augustus. Now remember, Herod was always dependent on Roman support to stay in power. Had Herod felt that he was losing Roman support, he feared that he was going to lose power. And since this war with the Nabateans went really bad, he felt that he was about to lose power with the Roman emperor, which could cost him his throne. This really began to trigger a paranoia within King Herod. And this paranoia led him to execute his wife and her mother, brother, grandfather, and children. Herod even had 2 of his own sons executed because his paranoia was getting so bad. And then in response to these all these executions, the Roman Emperor Augustus quipped, it would be safer to be one of Herod's pet pigs than one of his sons. And then, but the paranoia didn't stop with just Herod's family. He had hundreds of Judeans thrown in prison and publicly executed. He even gave out mass orders for the mass execution of over 300 soldiers. And he also gave out orders that upon his death, all nobles would be brought into the amphitheater and shot full of arrows. So he just went paranoid. He was just going after everyone around him. And this really started in about 10 BC. And this is where you start to see Christ coming in, because it's believed that Christ was born between 6 BC and 4 BC. And the Bible says that the men from the east came, and it also says that the men from the east were magi. Now, the dominant religion of the Parthians at the time was Zoroastrianism. And the Zoroastrian clergy are called magi. So you have Parthian clergy who are Zoroastrian coming in to worship Christ. Remember, Parthia had long been an enemy of Rome and King Herod. Remember, in 40 BC, it was the Parthians who invaded and forced Herod out of Judea, and Herod had to spend 3 years fighting the Parthians again. And that was just one war that was fought between the Parthians and the Romans. Mark Antony also fought the Parthians, and the Parthians killed Marcus Crassus. So this was a long-standing fight between the two sides. And so when the Parthians, the Magi, when they came in, said, "We are looking for the king of the Jews," they told that to a paranoid king who thought that he was losing favor with the Roman Empire. So King Herod thought that Christ is coming in to challenge him for his kingship. And King Herod thought, "Well, I'm the king of the Jews, so who are you coming in to visit?" Which is why King Herod told the Magi, "Hey, go find him baby Jesus and bring him back to me. That way I can worship him." But King Herod just wanted baby Jesus killed. But as the Bible records, the Magi did not return to King Herod. They went back to Parthia. And King Herod was the paranoid king. He knew he was just double-crossed at that point, and he thought that baby Jesus was out to steal his throne from him. And so that's when King Herod ordered all the baby boys in Bethlehem to be massacred. And this became known as the Massacre of the Innocents. And the Bible also says that Joseph and Mary were warned about what was about to happen. And so Joseph and Mary fled to Egypt. And remember, by this time, Egypt was now a province of the Roman Empire. The wars were over. It was stabilized because King Herod's influence never extended down to Egypt, so it was out of Herod's reach. And Joseph and Mary remained in Egypt until King Herod passed away in the year 4 BC in Jericho. And then after King Herod passed away, the Roman Emperor Augustus decreed that Judea would be split into 3 parts, honoring Herod's will, because Herod still had 3 remaining sons alive. Each one of them took over a part of Judea. So with that, baby Jesus went down to Egypt, and eventually he came back, and about 30 years later, he began his ministry. And as we know, the Bible records that Judas betrayed Jesus. But why did he betray Jesus is the question. Now, Judas, he's one of the 12 disciples in the Bible. The Bible says he received 30 pieces of silver for betraying Jesus. However, it doesn't say that he betrayed him for the money. It just says he received the money for betraying him. Because the Bible also says that he threw the money away after speaking to the high priest. Because had Judas betrayed Jesus for the money, he would have just taken the money, never would have heard from him again. He also didn't do it for the favor of the high priest. Because had he done it for the favor of the high priest, he wouldn't have thrown the money back at the high priest and walked away. He would have probably become some Pharisee somewhere, and he would have lived out the rest of his life. Instead, Judas said that he just killed an innocent man. So you can argue that Judas probably didn't think Christ was going to be killed. Because after he threw the money back to the high priest, because he didn't want the money, he didn't want the favor of the high priest anymore, he knew he just killed an innocent. The Bible says that Judas hung himself. So you're most likely looking at an ideological reason for Judas betraying Jesus. But what is that reason? Because one thing in Jewish history, there's always somebody of God who comes in and delivers the Jews from captivity. Moses delivered the children of Israel from Egyptian slavery. We had other examples like Esther. She delivered her people from destruction. You had the Maccabean revolt, which freed the Judea from Greek control. So during this time, they thought that the Messiah was going to come in, he's going to free them from Roman occupation, and he's going to reestablish Judea as an independent kingdom, and he's going to establish peace. So that's what the Judeans were waiting on during the time of Christ. However, here's one thing Christ said in Luke 17. Once on being asked by the Pharisees when the kingdom of God would come, Jesus replied, "The kingdom of God is not something that can be observed, nor people will say, 'Here it is,' or 'There it is,' because the kingdom of God is in your midst." He also said in John 18, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jewish leaders. But now my kingdom is in another place." Remember, they thought the Messiah was going to come in, reestablish Judean independence, bring themselves from the Romans. But Christ said right here, "No, I'm not going to do it. I am not here to set up a physical kingdom. I'm here to set up a spiritual kingdom." So what Christ did does not meet the expectations of what many people thought during his time that he was going to do. Because during the time of Christ, there were 4 main groups. One was the Pharisees, then the Sadducees, then the Essenes. Those were the clergy. Then you also had the Zealots. The Zealots, they were a wing of the Jews who eagerly awaited the Messiah and believed in a revolt against the Romans. As I said, they were waiting for the Messiah to come in, lead an army against Roman control. It was also the Zealots who led the revolt in the first Jewish-Roman war from 680 to 73 AD. That's decades after Christ was crucified. So they were a very militant wing of the Jews at the time. And so here's what the Bible says regarding Jesus' disciples. These are the names of the 12 apostles. First, Simon, who is called Peter, and his brother Andrew. James' son, Zebedee, and his brother John. Philip and Bartholomew. Thomas and Matthew, the tax collector. James' son, Alphaeus, and Thaddeus. Simon the Zealot, and Judas Iscariot. Because right here it says Simon, he was one of the Zealots at the time, since that was one of the major groups waiting the Messiah. Simon intended to join the army of the Messiah when he arrived, but Jesus was not there to lead an army, and even though he was originally a Zealot, Simon ended up following Christ. And then you have Judas Iscariot, who betrayed Christ. Because notice, Judas Iscariot is the only last name you have for one of the disciples. The rest of them are whether the brother of, whether the son of, the Zealot, or the tax collector. This is the only last name you get. So let's break down Judas's name. The first name, Judas. Judas was a very popular name at the time because Judas Maccabeus led a revolt against the Greeks. That was the Maccabean revolt. So that very popular name at the time, doesn't tell us much. Iscariot, that was his last name, was the Hebrew for the region that he was from, which is Carioth, and that is mentioned in the Old Testament. But this is also a Latin version of his name, that's Sicarius. In Latin means assassin or murderer. Because remember, the Zealots, that was the militant wing waiting to rise up against the Romans. A wing of the Zealots were the Sicarii, since they hid their blades in their cloaks. The Sicarii were known for attacking Romans and their sympathizers. Because what they do, they hide their blades in their cloaks. If you're a sympathizer, they literally just kill you in broad daylight, which is why the Romans started calling them assassins or murderers, or Sicarius. The Sicarius were originally based in Galilee. Remember, Jesus was a Galilean. That's where he preached from. So you had one of the assassins for the Zealots coming in and becoming one of Christ's disciples. At a certain point, Judas probably thought that Christ was not the Messiah. He probably started to think that he was a false Messiah. Because one, he wasn't leading a rebellion against the Romans. Another one, he was interacting with the Gentiles. So remember, a Roman centurion came to Christ one time asking for healing from his friends. And Christ looked at the Roman Gentile, who would have been a pagan, and said that you have showed greater faith than anyone in Judea. So that was something that was just not acceptable to the Jews at the time. Paying taxes to Caesar, because Christ said, render to Caesar's what is Caesar's, and render to God's what is God's. They're like, why are you paying taxes to Caesar? The Messiah is supposed to free us from Roman control, not have us pay taxes to him. He also opened up salvation to the Gentiles, because they thought that the Jews thought they were the chosen people. Only they can be near Christ. Only they can be near God. Why is he opening up salvation to the Gentiles? You can't do this if you're the Messiah. Christ also wasn't setting up a physical kingdom. He was setting up a spiritual kingdom. They thought, wait, you're supposed to lead us in rebellion and free us from Roman control. Why aren't you doing that? So at a certain point, Judas probably thought that Christ was a false Messiah, which is when the clergy came to him and said, we will give you 30 pieces of silver if you turn him over to us. And he agreed. And as you know, Judas betrayed Jesus, and this is what led to his execution and his crucifixion. And with that, that concludes my presentation. And these are the sources I used. One of the YouTube videos, along with 2 books I used, Life of Rome's First Emperor Augustus, and Cleopatra, A Life. And I also used the New International Version of the Bible. So, thank you for listening to my presentation, and I hope you enjoyed it.